Richard Ramirez is one of the most heinous serial killers for his reign of terror in the mid-1980s in Southern California. Welcome everyone to this episode of Raven Tales of Terror podcast. I'm your host, Ravian Wolfsbane, and tonight we are delving into the dark and twisted story of Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker. I want to issue a content warning for today's episode as it will explore sensitive and graphic details about his crime, so viewer discretion is advised. The life of Richard Ramirez, later known as the Night Stalker, is a tragic tale marked by a series of distressing events during his formative years. Born in 1960, he was the youngest of 5 children. Ramirez was exposed to violence and abuse at a young age and witnessed his father's criminal behavior and violent actions. His father was a raging alcoholic and often took out his anger issues on his wife and children. Ramirez allegedly began using substances at only 10 years old. These early experiences, coupled with a tumultuous upbringing, left him vulnerable to the influence of his cousin and mentor, Miguel Ramirez, a Vietnam War veteran with his own troubled past. Miguel introduced Richard to a world of drugs, violence, and criminal activities, shaping his behavior in dark ways. Richard often spent time with Miguel, learning and adopting his cousin's destructive tendencies. Reports suggest that Miguel may have even initiated Richard into his first criminal activities, leaving an enduring impact on his impressionable mind. It is alleged that Richard had been subjected to sexual abuse by Miguel during his childhood. This traumatic experience likely contributed to his descent into darkness and violence, alongside his morbid fascination with true crime stories. On May 4th, 1973, Miguel was arrested after he fatally shot his wife in the face after an argument. Richard was present for this incident. Ramirez would later say that being present for this incident was not traumatic, but he was actually fascinated. After his cousin was arrested, he moved in with his sister and her husband. Her husband was a peeping Tom and would take Ramirez to spy on women through their windows. By the time he was a teenager, he began using LSD and began his interest in Satanism. In 1977, he began working at a hotel. During this time at the hotel, he was known to have stolen from guests' rooms and even attempted to rape a female guest. The husband of the guest stopped Ramirez and police were called. However, the charges were dropped. Ramirez was then terminated by the hotel, and his life was veering out of control with his drug and alcohol use as well as his petty crimes. This resulted in him dropping out of school and struggling with stability in employment and relationships. He also suffered a head injury during his teenage years. The exact circumstances surrounding the injury are not well documented, but it is believed to have occurred around 1975 when Ramirez was 15 years old. The injury is said to have left him with memory loss and cognitive impairments, which could have contributed to his erratic behavior and criminal tendencies. This account underscores the profound influence of early experiences, negative influences, and personal challenges on an individual's development and choices. It emphasized the critical need for support and guidance for those vulnerable to destructive influences, aiming to prevent the cycle of violence and crime. The sounds of a slamming door marked the beginning of Ramirez's descent into madness, as he embarked on a spree of breaking into homes and escalating to more violent and sadistic acts. His disturbed psyche provided a fertile ground for malevolence, leading to the unleashing of horrors upon the world. The seeds of Richard Ramirez's murderous rampage were sown in his troubled and tormented early life. His upbringing, combined with his own dark desires and twisted beliefs, created a perfect storm of evil that would leave a trail of death and destruction in its wake. Richard moved from Texas to California at the age of 22. In 1984, he murdered a 9-year-old girl in the basement of where he was living, and he raped and beat the girl before stabbing her to death. In 2009, DNA was found at the crime scene, placing Ramirez. However, he was never officially charged with the murder. Ramirez's next victim was a 79-year-old widow who lived alone in a small apartment in Los Angeles. On June 28th of 1984, Ramirez broke into the apartment in the middle of the night, and he violently attacked her, stabbing her repeatedly in the head, neck, and chest before assaulting her corpse. She was stabbed so many times that she was nearly decapitated, and the body was discovered by her son the next morning. This brutal murder marked the beginning of Richard Ramirez's reign of terror as the Night Stalker. Over the next year, Ramirez would go on to commit a series of horrifying crimes, including multiple murders, attempted murders, sexual crimes, and burglaries. The widow's murder remains one of the many tragic and senseless acts of violence carried out by Ramirez during his rampage of terror in California. In March of 1985, Ramirez attacked a 22-year-old woman and shot her in the face outside of her home as she was pulling into her garage. She survived as the bullet ricocheted off the keys she was holding. Ramirez then walked into the home where the victim's roommate was inside. The 34-year-old was ducking behind a counter after she heard the gunshots, and Ramirez shot her in the forehead, and she died instantly. Ramirez stole any valuables he could find in the home, and less than an hour later, he ambushes a woman getting out of her car in the parking lot and shot her with a handgun and ran. At this time, the media dubbed him the walking killer and the Valley Intruder. On March 27, 1985, at about 2 a.m., he broke into a home outside of Whittier that he had previously broken into. A 64-year-old male was asleep next to his 44-year-old wife. Ramirez shot the husband in the head, killing him, and the gunshot woke up the wife. Ramirez beat her, bound her hands together, and demanded to know where the valuables inside of the home were located. While Ramirez ransacked the house, she was able to get out of her binds and get her shotgun from under the bed. However, the shotgun was unloaded. Ramirez shot her 3 times, ending her life. He then gets a carving knife from the now deceased couple's kitchen and carved into her torso and gouged out her eyes. He put her eyes into a jewelry box and took the jewelry box with him. Ramirez was wearing sneakers, and as he left the home, he left footprints. Bullets were also found at the scene, and police were able to match both of these pieces of evidence to previous attacks. Ramirez broke into another home on May 14th of a 66-year-old man and his 56-year-old wife. He entered the man's bedroom and shot him in the face as he went for his handgun. Richard then entered the wife's bedroom, bound her, and raped her after searching the home for valuables. Bill inevitably died of his injuries in the hospital. On May 29th, Richard drove a car he stole and broke into a house through an unlocked door. The house belonged to an 83-year-old woman and her disabled 81-year-old sister. He used a hammer he found in the kitchen to beat one of the sisters and bound her in the bedroom and then bludgeoned the other sister before using an electrical cord to shock her. After he raped the woman, he used her sister's lipstick to draw a satanic symbol on her and on the walls of both of their bedrooms. The women were found 2 days later, still alive but unconscious. One sister succumbed to her injuries, and the other survived the brutal attack but no longer spoke and was permanently hospitalized. July 2nd, Richard drove to Arcadia with a stolen car and broke into a window of a grandmother's home. He found her asleep in her bedroom and beat her with a lamp until she was unconscious. He then stabbed her to death using a 10-inch butcher knife from the home's kitchen. He stabbed her repeatedly even after she had died. July 5th, Ramirez broke into another home through an unlocked window and beat a 16-year-old girl with a tire iron as she slept. He kicked her in the head, leaving a shoe mark. Ramirez attempted to find a knife, but his search was fruitless, so he attempted to strangle her with a telephone cord. The cord allegedly began to spark and the victim began breathing, and Richard fled as he believed Jesus intervened to save her. The girl needed cosmetic surgeries because of the attack, but she survived. On July 7th, Ramirez broke into a 61-year-old woman's home while she slept on her couch and beat her to death by stomping on her face repeatedly. A shoe print from his sneaker was on her face, and that same night he went to a 63-year-old woman's home, assaulting and handcuffing the woman at gunpoint. He sexually assaulted her and then robbed her. After this attack, Ramirez decided to get a weapon for his attacks and purchased a machete. In between his attacks, Richard would steal multiple cars throughout his attacks, and he would clean the inside before leaving it to steal another. On July 20th, Ramirez drove to the home of 66-year-old woman and her 68-year-old husband. He broke into their bedroom and slashed them both with a machete. He then killed them both with a handgun. He continued to mutilate their bodies with the machete before robbing them. On the same night, he broke into a family's home and shot a 32-year-old man in the head, killing him before raping and beating the 32-year-old woman. He then bound their 8-year-old son and sodomized him. August 6th, Ramirez broke into the home of a 30-year-old man and a 27-year-old woman. He crept into their bedroom and shot the woman in the face after startling her. He then shot Chris in the neck and attempted to run, however the man fought back. Richard fired twice, missing before escaping. The couple survived the attack. 2 nights later, on August 8th, Richard broke into the home of a husband and wife. Ramirez went into their bedroom and shot the husband in the head with a handgun, killing him. He handcuffed and beat the wife before forcing her to tell him where any of the valuables were and raped her. August 18th, Ramirez entered the home of a 66-year-old man and his 62-year-old wife. He shot the husband in the temple, killing him, and he beat and sexually assaulted the wife and left her for dead. He left another shoe print at the scene of the attack. After a press release detailing the ballistics of the footprint evidence and the gun caliber, Ramirez drove to the Golden Gate Bridge and threw his sneakers in the water. August 24th, he drove to another family's home in a stolen vehicle. He was lurking outside of the window when the 13-year-old son observed Ramirez and woke up his parents. Richard begins to flee in the stolen car when the son runs outside and makes a note of the vehicle's description. They called the police and reported the incident. The vehicle was later located and a fingerprint was found on the rearview mirror. They were able to link the fingerprint to Richard Ramirez and officially released his mugshot to the public. The Night Stalker showed no mercy, targeting men, women, and even children. His victims were chosen at random, making it even more difficult for law enforcement to catch him. For over a year, Ramirez spread fear and panic throughout California, leaving a trail of death and destruction in his wake. But what made Richard Ramirez truly terrifying was his cold and remorseless demeanor. He showed no signs of guilt or empathy for his victims, reveling in the pain and suffering he caused. Ramirez believed himself to be a servant of Satan, claiming that he was driven by dark forces to commit his crimes. Ramirez was ultimately caught due to a combination of his own carelessness and the vigilance of the public and law enforcement. On August 30th, Ramirez took a bus to Tucson, Arizona, where his brother was living. After he was unable to meet with his brother, he returned to the Los Angeles area. Richard was walking on the streets when he saw his face on the front of multiple newspapers, and Richard began to flee and attempt to steal a car. Multiple witnesses stopped him, and he continued his attempt to flee. He attempted more carjackings when a group of over 10 residents chased Ramirez down the street. He was struck over the head and beaten by the group. The police came and apprehended Ramirez. Upon his arrest, Ramirez was found to have a stolen handgun and various items of stolen property in his possession. He was officially identified as the notorious Night Stalker. Ramirez's arrest brought an end to his reign of terror, and he later was convicted and sentenced to death for his horrific crimes. The capture of Richard Ramirez was a result of the collaborative efforts of the public, law enforcement, and investigative work, which ultimately led to the apprehension of one of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history. During the court proceedings of Richard Ramirez's case, which took place in 1988 in Los Angeles, California, Ramirez faced the total of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The trial was highly publicized and drew significant media attention due to the gruesome nature of Ramirez's crimes and his infamous reputation as the Night Stalker. Ramirez's behavior in court was erratic and defiant. He often displayed a lack of remorse for his actions, flashing a devil horn hand gesture and shouting out statements such as "Hail Satan" and "evil" during his trial, as well as having a pentagram carved into his hand that he proudly displayed to the courtroom. The courtroom outbursts and disruptions caused chaos and outrage among his victims' families and the general public. On August 3rd, it was reported by jail employees that Richard was overheard saying that he was planning to shoot the prosecutor with a gun. A metal detector was placed at the entrance of the courtroom, and searches were conducted on everyone entering the courtroom. August 14th, one of the female jurors was not present in the courtroom, and she was later found shot to death in her home. The jury was terrified and believed that it was Richard who was the perpetrator. However, it was later determined it was unrelated to the trial as the juror's boyfriend shot her and then committed suicide. Despite Richard's attempts and other disruption to the proceedings, Ramirez was eventually found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death in 1989, after he was convicted of all 43 charges. However, he would remain on death row for over 2 decades, as appeals and legal changes delayed his execution. He eventually died of complications from B-cell lymphoma while still on death row in 2013 at the age of 53, never facing the death penalty for his heinous crimes. Despite the gruesome nature of his crimes, Ramirez developed a cult-like following of fans and admirers, some of whom were infatuated with his dark and mysterious image. These fans, often referred to as groupies, wrote letters to Ramirez, visited him in prison, and even sent him gifts and money. Some of his supporters believed in Ramirez's innocence and saw him as a rebellious anti-hero or a symbol of defiance against societal norms. Others were attracted to his dark and menacing persona, finding him intriguing and alluring. The phenomenon of individuals becoming infatuated with notorious criminals like Richard Ramirez is a complex and controversial topic, often attributed to various psychological and sociological factors. Some experts suggest that these fans may have a distorted view of reality or may be seeking attention or validation through their association with an infamous criminal. Richard Ramirez even married while he was in prison, awaiting trial for his crimes. In 1996, Ramirez married Doreen Loy, a freelance magazine editor who had corresponded with him through letters and visits. Loy was one of Ramirez's supporters and believed in his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Their relationship was controversial and garnered media attention, with Loy often defending Ramirez and proclaiming his innocence in interviews. However, their marriage was short-lived and they reportedly separated in 2009. It is important to note that the glorification of individuals who have committed heinous crimes can be harmful and disrespectful to the victims and their families. While Richard Ramirez may have a small group of fans, the majority of the public condemned his actions and sought justice for the victims. There are several theories about the possible explanations behind Richard Ramirez's crimes, but it is important to note that these are just speculative and not definitive answers. Some possible theories include childhood trauma. Ramirez had a troubled childhood marked by physical abuse from his father and a head injury at a young age. Some psychologists believe that these early experiences may have contributed to his violent behavior later in life. Mental illness. Ramirez exhibited signs of mental illness, including schizophrenia and personality disorders. Some experts suggest that his mental health issues may have played a role in his violent actions. Substance abuse. Ramirez was known to use drugs and alcohol, which can alter judgment and impulse control. Some believe that substance abuse may have fueled his violent behavior. Social and environmental factors. Ramirez grew up in a dysfunctional and impoverished environment, which may have influenced his behavior. Some experts argue that social and environmental factors such as exposure to violence or criminal behavior can contribute to someone becoming a violent offender. Sadistic tendencies. Some experts believe that Ramirez derived pleasure from inflicting pain and terror on his victims, suggesting that he may have had sadistic tendencies. Overall, the reasons behind Richard Ramirez's crimes remain complex and multifaceted, and no single theory can fully explain his heinous actions. His case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and forensics experts to understand the psychology behind serial killers and prevent similar crimes in the future. The case of Richard Ramirez had a significant impact on the justice system in several ways. Number 1, increased awareness of serial killers. Ramirez's brutal crimes and the subsequent media coverage brought attention to the issue of serial killers and the importance of identifying and catching them before they can commit further atrocities. This raised awareness led to advancements in profiling techniques and investigative strategies to capture serial offenders more quickly. Number 2, forensic evidence. The investigation into Ramirez's crimes utilized advanced forensic techniques such as DNA testing and fingerprint analysis, which helped link him to the crime scenes and secure his conviction. This case highlighted the importance of forensic evidence in modern criminal investigation and led to its increased use in solving violent crimes. It also increased public safety measures as the fear and panic caused by Ramirez's crimes prompted increased public safety measures, such as neighborhood watch programs, increased police patrols in high-crime areas, and heightened vigilance among community members. The case also prompted discussions about the need for improved mental health services and support for at-risk individuals. Number 4, legal reforms. The trial and sentencing of Richard Ramirez shed light on the flaws and limitations of the criminal justice system, leading to discussions about potential legal reforms to ensure that serial killers and other violent offenders receive appropriate punishments and are prevented from committing further crimes. This case may have prompted changes in sentencing laws and procedures to better protect the public from dangerous offenders. Overall, the case of Richard Ramirez served as a catalyst for changes and improvement in the justice system to better address the challenges posed by violent criminals and protect the safety and well-being of the community. Richard Ramirez, the infamous serial killer known as the Night Stalker, died on June 7th of 2013 while on death row at San Quentin State Prison in California. Ramirez spent over 23 years on death row before his death. Despite his death, Ramirez's crimes and his dark legacy continue to fascinate and horrify people to this day. While he is no longer alive, the memory of his brutal attacks still live on in the collective consciousness as a reminder of the darkest aspects of the human behavior. Thank you for listening to this episode of Raven Tales of Terror podcast. Join us next time as we delve into another dark and mysterious story. And until then, stay safe and be wary of the monsters that lurk in the shadows.